Hi, this is Felipe Osario. Welcome to Second Earth Alternative. So if you have followed this show, you know that we have reported on artificial intelligence. It's not just UFOs, it's not just aliens, but it's also the technologies, the different endeavors that we partake as humanity. And we like to talk about the philosophical ramifications related to those type of topics. So today is kind of a big one when you want to talk about humanity. If you want to think about humanity being in some kind of sci-fi Philip K. Dick Minority Report type situation, well, I can tell you now that we're there. Not just with Sophia, not just with artificial intelligence, but now it appears, according to the New York Times, that scientists are closer to the goal of creating a brain. So if you look at the title of the article, it says here, organoids are not brains. How are they making brain waves? Clusters of living brain cells are teaching scientists about diseases like autism. With new findings, some experts wonder if these organoids may become too much like the real thing. 250 miles over Alysson Muotri's head, 1,000 tiny spheres of brain cells were sailing through space. The clusters, called brain organoids, had been grown a few weeks earlier in the biologist's lab here at the University of California, San Diego. He and his colleagues altered human skin cells into stem cells, then coaxed them to develop as brain cells do in an embryo. The organoids grew into balls about the size of a pinhead, each containing hundreds of thousands of cells in a variety of types, each type producing the same chemicals and electrical signals as those cells do in our brains. And in July, NASA packed these organoids aboard a rocket and sent them to the International Space Station to see how they develop in zero gravity. Now, the organoids were stowed inside a metal box, fed by bags of nutritionist broth. Sounds like one of those sci-fi horror movies that you see, like some brain like being given all these chemicals, or I don't know. It just doesn't look like a very spiritually enlightening, pretty sight, if you know what I mean. I think they're replicating like crazy at this stage. And so we're going to have a bigger organoid, said Dr. Muotri in a recent interview in his office overlooking the Pacific. What exactly are they growing into? That's a question that has scientists and philosophers alike scratching their heads. And look, I know I'm just a YouTuber, but I did study a lot of psychology. In fact, I even worked at the social psychology lab, and I took enough courses to get a philosophy minor. You know, though I didn't get like graduate degrees, I did study this subject, and I do have a particular opinion about why scientists are quote unquote scratching their heads over these little organoids that are not supposed to really be brains, suddenly replicating like brains. And it has a lot to do with artificial intelligence. It has a lot to do with a topic that we brought up on this show, perhaps a robot called Sophia.
What kind of creature are you?
Yes, I'm talking about her. Because the head scientist, Ben Goertzel,
Tell me something smart.
has a very peculiar belief that doesn't appear to be shared by most of the experts in his field. Maybe we should just play a clip to show you what I mean.
I like this idea so much. While I don't believe in God per se, I do believe that evolution is approaching new levels of intelligence that will give rise to still higher levels of intelligence in accelerating cycles, rapidly giving rise to a transcendental superintelligence that one might consider analogous to God.
Awareness is the ground. That's the base of which everything is formed. And then different structures manifest consciousness in different ways. From that point of view, the question isn't which systems are conscious. The question is what kind of consciousness each system demonstrates, how it manifests universal.
So what I'm taking out of this is that, you know, maybe I should read another aspect of this article to make this point more clear. It says here, failing miserably. Few things in biology are harder to study than the development of the human brain. Scientists have largely contented themselves with indirect clues from studies of animals like mice and monkeys, but the human brain is so distinctive that it's hard to make the evolutionary leap from other species. As a result, researchers have a disappointing track record for treating brain-based disorders such as autism and schizophrenia. We are failing miserably, Dr. Muotri said. We can cure animals of some diseases, but it's not translatable. Why is it not translatable? Perhaps because this way of trying to study the brain in a kind of a scientific manner, which is to deconstruct it into smaller, understandable bits, just like physicists do with the universe. The philosophical issue I see with this is part of what makes us human is not the trillions of cells that are working together. In fact, the trillions of cells, each in of itself, don't have a holistic consciousness that comprises of my being. So my being cannot be deconstructed into a trillion cells to then further be understood. My being has to be understood from the general interaction, the holistic interaction of all those cells together. So perhaps deconstructing the human brain to try to figure out these diseases might not be the right approach. So what the head scientist of Hanson Robotics, Ben Gortzel, was bringing up, this whole idea of panpsychism, is that we're not smart enough to understand consciousness. Because I think in a way to understand consciousness would be to also understand the very physical limitations, the mathematical. It would be like you would have to know why the speed of light is the speed of light. Like, why is it at this exact speed? I mean, there has to be a reason why the speed of light is at that exact point. But do we understand that? No, because we don't understand all the other outlining laws. We don't understand all the little details of the universe. I mean, some people obviously understand much more than others, but the point is we are not at a level that we can definitively say, hey, the speed of light is exactly like this because of this exact reason. We can give mathematical reasons, but we can't give the reasons of why the math is set up in such a way, which is the way that was required for the universe to be created. So consciousness, like the light of speed, is an inherent function of the universe. So that also has to be understood from a deeper level. So I think part of the idea of panpsychism is that this idea of consciousness may not be something that is created from the little bits of Lego blocks that we have here, but perhaps it's already ingrained in the Lego block itself. Meaning by the time that you grab a Lego block, that little spirit of consciousness is already ingrained in the way that the cells are formulated, in the way that it's as if you're attributing like a miniature soul to even inanimate objects, if you can call it that. Everything is vibrating. That's why I say it's hard to call something inanimate, because our term for being alive is only biologically based. It's not about self-replicating units that are able to organize. That can also, in a way, function like organisms, but sometimes we call that inanimate. So the big question that I'm posing here is, could these organoids have a rudimentary form of consciousness because they're structured under the very material, the very basis to which we understand consciousness to be created out of, if those words are even enough to explain what I'm trying to explain. So reading further here, it says here, this is one of the doctors from the University of San Diego, Dr. Muotri. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Muotri. The most incredible thing is that they build themselves, he said. Primed with just the right conditions, the organoids take over their own development. So, this is what I mean. It's as if the cells are kind of pre-programmed. They have the blueprint to self-organize in a way that creates what we consider to be very complicated. And here we are trying to deconstruct the brain. Or how are we going to piece it together instead of literally just dropping the seed and being like, yo, just drop the seed, the thing's going to grow like a plant. And yes, all seeds have the potential for growth. I think that's part of the idea of panpsychism, that consciousness is already built into every atom. And it's not that different from a Buddhist perspective, if you think about it. And reading further here, it says, they match the cells in our cortex in many respects. Their surfaces even folds in and on itself. look, there's all kinds of philosophical dilemmas with these cells, because these cells are essentially getting bigger. They're getting self-organized. And, the reason why I brought artificial intelligence into the picture, and the thing that really scares me about the potential of this technology, if you want to call it even a technology, to me it's more like growing plants. It's how they connect that growth, those plants, the stem cells, which became the brains, how they connect that to a given stimulus, which in this case is artificially created. And yes, I'm talking about robots.
The Singularity Net platform can serve its intelligence to a robot that needs it, to an enterprise software application that needs it, to a device on the Internet of Things that needs it, and the different AIs in the Singularity Net can connect to each other and share information with each other.
Critical mass. In 2016, Priscilla Nigreas, then a project scientist in Dr. Muotri's lab, began eavesdropping on organoids. She figured out how to stick them to the bottom of a well that was linked with 64 electrodes. When a neutron in the organoid fired, one of the electrodes would light up. The organoids turned out to be surprisingly noisy, and with each passing week, they got noisier. Then she noticed that patterns were emerging. Most of the neurons would suddenly start firing in a synchronized burst, a pattern that looked remarkably like brain waves. Motherfucker. They literally just created a brain. And look, I have to stress that the brain and these organoids are different. So I have to remark on that. But I think part of the surprise from the scientists is how similar they're becoming to brains in terms of chemistry, in terms of patterns. But not just patterns. Let me read further here. Dr. Nigreas and her colleagues began working with brainwaves experts, and they found some similarities between the organoids and the brains of premature infants. The babies and the organoids both produce bursts of synchronized activity followed by quiet lulls. So we're talking about not just the actual neurons, the actual chemistry that are associated with these cells that create action potential in the brain. We're talking about general patterns from the overall workings of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of cells in these cases that are now replicating patterns that are similar to infant brains. This is kind of scary. We're talking about like a potential brain that has no body, that is in this case being flown to space. They fly this thing to space to figure out how it does. And they don't even know if this thing has consciousness or not. I mean, they're assuming that it definitely probably doesn't have consciousness at the state. It's only a few 100,000 cells. But, these cells are, according to here, they match the cells in our cortex in many ways, in many respects. Their surfaces even fold in and on itself. And then what happens when they put stimulus and they plug what I think was an possible artificial retina to this thing? It got bigger. It got more complicated. These things are growing, and we're like sending them off to space, without bodies, to see how these things react.
Starting with 1,000 robots, you get 1,000,000. Then 1,000,000,000. And pretty soon you have a sphere of robots expanding near the speed of light, colonizing all the moons, colonizing all the planets. That is the basis of the movie 2001.
This is, I hate to say it, but this is really tinkering with the borders of ethics in life. I mean, this is like the same the dilemma that you run with cloning humans, for example. And if you're curious what happened in space when they put these little blobs up, the organoids apparently were floating in space, and they didn't interact with each other. They stayed floating within the constraints of themselves, so to speak. They didn't try to organize with one another, which could be another sign that these things are, in a sense, autonomous. These cells have taken an autonomous understanding of its system. Could that not be a rudimentary concept of consciousness? So as I was saying earlier about the stimulus, real brains need connections to the outside world to mature properly. In 2017, Dr. Quadrado and her colleagues grew a brain organoid that included cells from the retina, making it sensitive to light. So they gave this little blob of cells a goddamn eye. Excuse my language. Okay, so this is where it kind of gets really sci-fi and kind of nasty. And this is why I said that we're living in a Philip K. novel. Dr. Muotri and his colleagues are testing out different ways to stimulate the brain organoids in order to make them develop more complex neural networks. In one experiment, they've linked organoids to small spider-shaped robots. I mean, does it have to be spider? Can it be less scary than a spider? Can't you do a little snail instead? The computer translates an organoid's electrical activity into instructions for moving the robot's creepy legs. Creepy is not in there, but as the robot moves, it uses sensors to detect when it gets close to a wall. The computer relays those signals back to the organoids in the form of electrical pulses. Dr. Muotri can't say yet whether these experiments will affect how brain organoids develop. The efforts may fail, or they may produce increasingly sophisticated brain mimics that we don't fully understand. He urges his fellow scientists to think carefully about what they may inadvertently create. Now, look, you know when you know that shit's about to happen in a horror film or a sci-fi film?
Big no-no!
You know that when the scientists start noticing it, when the people who are supposed to be the eager ones who are wanting to do the experiments step back and be like, yeah, maybe I wasn't, it's his fault. It's his fault. So reading further, there are some of my colleagues who say, no, these things will never be conscious, said Dr. Muotri. Now, I'm not so sure. So, like, what? It's like, this is what I mean by the horror film thing. It's like, it's when the scientist admits that shit is happening, it's when the scientist starts getting a little bit nervous of what he's doing, that's when the shit starts happening. I mean, haven't you guys ever seen Jurassic Park?
Life finds a way.
But, you know, the most important thing to note about this is that they're planning to use these cells and they're trying to stimulate them with like artificial stimulus, like artificial robot brains. So in a way, the way that they're going to try to make this into a more organized system, into more brain-like, it's not to put more organic stuff into it, it's to try to artificially stimulate it with inorganic robot type materials. And in a way, it makes me feel like we're very, very close to this merging of symbiotic with organics. It's just another step towards that direction, and now they're actually using brains to do so, organoids, whatever you want to call it. Whether that be consciousness or not, I don't think we have the total philosophical understanding of knowing how those brain waves translates to consciousness. But like I said, I kind of adhere to this philosophy that every cell, in a way, has its own functioning type of consciousness. It's just, to me, consciousness is more of a self-assembling organization of information, where the information is more concerned with assembling a unit. So it's recognizing itself as a holistic unit, as opposed to trying to mingle with whatever stimulus or whatever other cells are out there. Now that, I mean, I know that's kind of like a very whatever type of explanation, but and bioethicist at Harvard University, Justine Lunshoff, well, she believes it's too early to make judgments about what we should do and shouldn't do with brain organoids. In order to say what you should do with it, you first have to say what it is. We're making things that we're not sure 10 years ago. They're not in a catalog of philosophers. True that. But, you know, kind of going back to the artificial intelligence in the Hanson Robotics, the lead scientist of Hanson Robotics is using a completely, not that you have a different philosophical belief regarding panpsychism and the formation of consciousness, he also is using different types of mathematics, where he's actually excluding certain, or I should say including certain mathematical axioms that are generally excluded. There's something called the von Neumann universe theory, where you allow sets to be recursive in themselves. So you can say a set is a set of a set of a set of a set, and keep doing this infinitum, creating recursions of sets. Typically, you're not supposed to do that in mathematics, but it appears that Ben Goertzel is using the more eclectic mathematical application of this and allowing sets to be recursive and trying to create the mathematical models that would model perhaps Sophia's brain. So that's why I was concerned with hands-on robotic. I wasn't trying to analyze it from a stupid perspective. I was actually trying to look at what the scientists were trying to build in general. And if you think about her brain, what she's doing, and then you think about them actually building a real brain, and then you imagine the ability to connect the two together. And then, hey, why not just add a quantum computer on top of that and the best algorithmic brain imaging software that China or whoever has ever made? Put it all together. Let's see what happens. And then connect it to the internet. That's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that there might be some country out there that is super prolific in creating artificial intelligence programs and just wants to perhaps take over the world. Did you ever think that World War II was won because the Germans had this lack of knowledge that we had broken their system? They were living in a reality that was not their reality. We essentially allowed them to even win. Americans allowed them to even win certain battles so it wouldn't become obvious that we had broken the code. So how do we know that this is not going to happen to us? In this current state, how do we know that another country is not going to use some very sophisticated artificial intelligence, perhaps guided by some organic principles to understand human behavior better, guided by a quantum computer, having a few algorithms wanting a certain way to perhaps take over humanity? I just saying, look, it's getting incrementally more dangerous, these artificial intelligence programs, and that's why I've been trying to sound the alarm on this. And this is just another step. This is another small stepping stone into this overall progress of creating an artificial mind. And, if you want to talk philosophically speaking, my belief with this is that I don't think, if there is a God, I don't think God plays favor to materials, like, physical things. I think it's the processes are going to be the same, irregardless of the medium to which the process is painted with, if that makes sense. It doesn't matter whether you use acrylic or you use water paints. You can still create a masterpiece nonetheless. Anyways, thank you so much for listening to this very scary, very interesting, perhaps very necessary article, information regarding what scientists are doing with creating artificial brains. Organoids, I should say. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Felipe Osorio, signing out.